Ever feel like you hit that 3 p.m. wall and you're like, okay, where's the sugar? You should probably grab something healthy, but
Yeah.
like that chocolate bar is just calling your name, right?
It's so true. And it's funny because we all know that sugar high is going to come with a crash. But, we still go for it anyway.
Exactly. And then we're left wondering, why do I feel so crummy? So that's what we're going to deep dive into today, like what actually happens in our bodies when we eat sugar and why it can leave us feeling, well, kind of terrible.
It's a great question. And the answer, like most things in nutrition, is a little more complicated than you might think.
And that's where you come in, right? To help us unpack all of this.
That's the plan. We're going to break down some of the science behind sugar, what happens from the moment you take that first bite to how it impacts your body long term.
I love it. So let's start with the basics. What is sugar exactly? I mean, we hear about glucose, fructose.
Yeah, it can get confusing for sure. So when we talk about sugar generally, we're usually talking about sucrose. And sucrose is actually made up of two simpler sugars, glucose and fructose.
Okay, so 2-for-1 deal with sugar. And what do those two actually do in our bodies?
Good question. Glucose is kind of the star player. It's the primary energy source for our cells.
So that's what gives us energy. Got it. What about fructose? Isn't that the sugar we find naturally in fruit?
Yes. Fructose is found naturally in fruit, but here's the thing. It's also heavily processed and added to tons of foods that, well, aren't exactly fruit.
Okay, so it sounds like not all sugars are created equal. Like there's a difference between the sugar in an apple and the sugar in a candy bar, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And a lot of it has to do with how those sugars are packaged. When you eat an apple, for example, you're getting fructose along with fiber, vitamins, minerals, all sorts of good stuff. It's like a whole package deal.
Yeah, makes sense. So what about that candy bar?
Well, that candy bar is mostly just giving you the sugar itself, the sucrose. It's like stripping away all the good stuff that usually comes with it and just leaving you with the pure sweetness.
Ah, so we're getting kind of a simplified version of sugar when we eat processed foods.
Exactly. And that's where things can start to go a little haywire in our bodies. We're essentially short-circuiting our system by giving it a concentrated dose of sugar without any of the natural buffers that help us process it properly.
Okay, so this is where it starts to get interesting. Let's say I give in to that sugar craving and take a bite of a cookie. What's actually happening in my body from that first bite? Where does it all begin?
Well, it all starts in your mouth. Right away, your saliva starts breaking down those complex sugars into simpler ones.
So our spit is getting in on the action. Who knew?
Oh, yeah, big time. And those bacteria that live in your mouth, the ones that can cause cavities, yeah, they love sugar too. In fact, it's their waste product that's acidic and can actually eat away at your tooth enamel.
Oh, great. So now I feel bad before the sugar even hits my stomach.
Don't worry, we'll get to the stomach in a minute. But first, while all that's happening in your mouth, your taste buds are sending signals to your brain, letting it know that something delicious is on its way.
And that's when the good feelings start to kick in,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Your brain releases dopamine, which is basically a neurotransmitter that makes us feel good. It's the same reward pathway that's activated by other pleasurable things, like
scrolling through social media.
Exactly. Or listening to music. It's all about that instant gratification.
Okay, so sugar is literally hitting our brain's pleasure centers. That explains a lot.
Right.
But from an evolutionary standpoint, why are we wired to crave sugar in the first place? I mean, it's not like our ancestors were downing donuts on the savannah.
You're right, they weren't. But back then, finding calorie-dense food was crucial for survival. Sugar is a quick source of energy, so it makes sense that our brains evolved to seek it out and reward us for finding it.
So we're basically hardwired for a world where sugar was scarce, not one where it's in practically everything we eat.
Exactly. Our brains are still playing catch-up. But in the meantime, all that sugar has to go somewhere, and the next stop on its journey is your small intestine.
Okay, so what happens in the small intestine? Is this where the sugar rush really kicks in?
You got it. This is where that glucose we talked about gets absorbed into your bloodstream.
And then our bodies can finally use that glucose for energy.
You got it. But it needs a little help from its friend, insulin. Insulin is like a key that unlocks your cells, allowing glucose to enter and be used for energy. Without insulin, glucose would just be stuck in the bloodstream with nowhere to go. Meanwhile, fructose takes a different path, heading straight to the liver for processing.
Interesting. So glucose is a quick energy, and insulin is what makes that energy available to our cells. What about fructose? What's the liver doing with all that sugar?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complex, and it's also where we start to see why that initial sugar rush can be so short-lived. But before we get into that, Have you ever wondered why you might feel shaky or lightheaded after that sugary snack?
Shaky, lightheaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely been there. It's like my body's sending me a warning signal.
Exactly. And it all comes down to how our bodies handle different types of sugar. When you eat something like a donut that's loaded with processed sugar, the glucose floods into your bloodstream really quickly.
Okay.
And your body's like, whoa, too much, too fast.
So our systems are getting overwhelmed. But why does that actually make us feel shaky or lightheaded? Like, what's the connection there?
Well, your body's actually pretty smart. It senses that sudden blood sugar spike and it's like, emergency, we got to get this under control. And so it releases a bunch of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
I don't know, stress hormone.
Yeah, not exactly what you want when you're just trying to enjoy a treat. But those hormones are what cause that rapid heartbeat, the shaky hands, maybe even a little lightheadedness.
So it's the stress hormones, not the sugar itself, that's giving me the jitters.
You got it. It's like your body is hitting the panic button even though you just thought you were treating yourself.
Makes sense. And then, of course, what goes up must come down. So what's actually happening when that sugar high wears off and we get that dreaded sugar crash?
Right. So remember how we were talking about insulin being like a key that unlocks our cells for glucose?
Yeah.
Well, when you eat a bunch of sugar, your body releases a surge of insulin to try to deal with all that glucose. But sometimes it overcompensates and your blood sugar drops too low too quickly, and bam, that's the sugar crash.
And then suddenly all you want is more sugar to get back to feeling normal.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle.
It really is. And unfortunately, it's a cycle that can have some long-term consequences too. But before we get into all that, let's talk about how different types of foods affect this process. Like you mentioned that cookie. Now compare that to, say, a piece of fruit.
Okay.
They both have sugar, but our bodies process those sugars very differently.
Right. You were saying before how it's like a slow burn versus a quick explosion.
Exactly. Complex carbs, like whole grains or naturally occurring sugars, like those found in fruits, are digested much more slowly. And part of that is because those foods also contain fiber. And that fiber helps to slow down the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream.
So instead of this dramatic spike and crash, our blood sugar levels stay more stable and we have more sustained energy.
Precisely. Imagine looking at a graph. That sugary drink is like a sharp peak, while a bowl of oatmeal is a gentle hill.
Okay.
They both offer energy, but one is short-lived and leaves you crashing down, while the other provides longer-lasting fuel for your body.
I like the sound of that gentle hill a lot better. So we've talked about the immediate effects of sugar, the good, the bad, and the shaky. But what about the long-term stuff? What about things like insulin resistance and fatty liver disease?
Yeah, those are definitely serious conditions, but it's important to remember that they don't just develop overnight.
Okay.
It's about patterns over time. Think of it like wear and tear on a car. The occasional short trip is fine, but if you're constantly pushing it to the limit, eventually something's going to give.
That's a good analogy. So how does that wear and tear actually happen in our bodies when we're talking about sugar?
Sure. So let's start with insulin resistance. Remember how we talked about insulin being like a key that unlocks our cells to let in glucose?
Yeah.
Well, with insulin resistance, those cells start becoming less responsive to insulin's signal.
Oh, so they're kind of getting tired of all that knocking.
Exactly. It's like they're getting bombarded with glucose so often that they become desensitized. They're like, yeah, I've heard it all before.
So they're not letting in as much glucose. What happens to it then?
That's the problem. It ends up staying in your bloodstream, and that leads to chronically elevated blood sugar levels. And over time, that can damage your blood vessels and increase the risk of developing some pretty serious health issues like type 2 diabetes and even heart disease.
That sounds really serious. And what about fatty liver disease? Where does that fit in?
So fatty liver disease is another potential consequence of too much sugar, and it mainly comes down to how our bodies handle fructose, that other simple sugar we talked about.
Okay.
And unlike glucose, which our cells can use throughout the body, fructose is mainly processed by the liver.
Okay.
So if we're eating a lot of fructose, our liver has to work overtime to process it all.
That sounds rough for your liver.
It is, and when it gets overwhelmed, it starts turning that excess fructose into fat, which can build up in the liver.
And then over time, that can lead to all sorts of problems, right?
Yeah.
Inflammation, scarring.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a good situation. And the scary thing is that a lot of people don't even realize they're at risk. But again, it's not about demonizing all sugar. It's about understanding the impact that our choices have on our health and making informed decisions.
Absolutely. So it all comes back to balance and being aware of where sugar is coming from. But with sugar hiding in so many foods, how can we navigate all of that? It feels overwhelming sometimes. It really does feel like there's sugar everywhere we turn.
It's true. It can feel like you're fighting a losing battle sometimes,
Right.
but it doesn't have to be that way.
So what can we actually do
Yeah.
besides, hiding under a rock and avoiding all processed food?
Well, for starters, get in the habit of actually reading those nutrition labels.
Okay.
You'd be surprised how much sugar is hiding in things that don't even taste that sweet.
Oh, tell me about it. Salad dressings, yogurt, even bread. It's like they're sneaking sugar into everything.
I know, right? Food manufacturers have gotten so good at making those swaps, like reducing fat but then upping the sugar to compensate for the taste.
Right.
But here's the thing. Once you start paying attention to those labels, you can be a much smarter shopper. Like maybe you choose the plain yogurt and add your own fruit for sweetness.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like taking control back instead of just letting the food companies tell us what to eat.
Exactly. And speaking of taking control, what about artificial sweeteners? Have you ever gone that route, like trying to satisfy your sweet tooth without all the extra calories and sugar?
Oh, for sure. It feels like the perfect solution, right? All the sweetness, none of the guilt. But are artificial sweeteners really all they're cracked up to be?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And honestly, the answer isn't so simple. Like, we know that artificial sweeteners don't directly affect our blood sugar levels in the same way that sugar does.
Right.
But they still activate those reward pathways in the brain that we were talking about earlier. Remember how we talked about dopamine and that feeling of pleasure?
Yeah, so even though we're tricking our taste buds, our brains are still like, woo, sugar rush.
Exactly. And some research even suggests that by constantly triggering those reward pathways without actually giving our brains the sugar they're expecting, it might actually make us crave sugary foods even more.
Oh, wow. So it could actually backfire.
It's definitely a possibility. It's still an area of ongoing research, but it's definitely something to be mindful of. Artificial sweeteners can be a useful tool, especially if you're trying to cut back on sugar, but they're not like a free pass to indulge without consequences.
Right. Moderation is
Yeah.
key with everything, right?
Absolutely. With artificial sweeteners, it seems like we're kind of venturing into uncharted territory. So until we know more, I think the best approach is just to be mindful, pay attention to how your body feels, and make choices that align with your health goals.
Makes sense. Well, this has been incredibly informative. Thank you so much for breaking down all the science of sugar for us in such a clear and engaging way.
Of course, it's been my pleasure. And remember, everyone, knowledge is power. The more you understand about how sugar affects your body, the better equipped you'll be to make choices that support your health and well-being.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of sugar. Remember, it's not about deprivation. It's about making informed choices that empower you to live your healthiest life.